So the temperance movement is where we left off, and from here you can see that the immigrants were being targeted, particularly with this one in this cartoon. But again, it loses attention because of slavery. But they even wrote songs about it. This is some sheet music for the song "The Lips That Touch Liquor Shall Never Touch Mine." I'm sure it was a happy little ditty. There were also other reform movements happening at this time. First, our mental hospitals were in a pretty severe state of disrepair and pretty scary places. And they didn't have a whole lot of structure or discipline. So you had people like Dorothea Dix, who pushed for them to be more like hospitals and to treat mental illness rather than to just imprison people. You can see from this image that we treated people fairly cruelly who were mentally ill. And here's one of her quotes: "I come in as an advocate of the helpless, forgotten, insane men and women, of being sunk to a condition from which the unconcerned world would start with real horror." Solitary confinement was pretty typical. You know, experimenting on people was pretty typical. It was pretty awful conditions. You also had schools opening for the blind and the deaf, particularly people who were not being educated in society, but were viewed as should be educated. And then there was also reform in prisons. Instead of punishing them, they were a place for people to repent. A lot of religions were given access to prisons and run the prisons. But here, the use of solitary confinement was encouraged and used, and a structure and a discipline, which was ultimately modeled on the mental hospitals created and encouraged by Dorothea Dix. Also, work programs. So, this is where chain gangs start to work. So, essentially, using them as kind of like slave labor. You also have calls for free public education for all kids, and this is part of that idea that we need to perpetuate a Republican democracy. So Horace Mann proposed common schools, which are your first real public schools in American history. He called for a longer school year, compulsory attendance up until, for most kids, 8th grade. The school year was built around what was still a very agricultural society. So our school schedule, even today, is still dictated by the seasons. And planting seasons in particular. And in fact, there are schools in southern Idaho that still get potato harvest off. Horace Mann also called for the increase of teacher prep, and so you have teacher colleges developing and popping up. And you had moral education, including the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. These are sort of some of the skills that were viewed to be necessary in an industrial society: hard work, punctuality, sobriety. So you can see the temperance movement has its hand in this one as well. And so here you have every town had a little school that popped up, and they would pay a teacher to usually live in the schoolhouse or with a local family. And the McGuffey Reader was the pretty standard text at the time. You also had the growth of private religious schools as well as land grant schools and universities across the country. I've attended 2 land grant universities. Ohio University, established in 1804, a year after Ohio got its state charter, and Montana State University up in Montana. And most of the land grant schools were to teach people about agriculture and new technology in agriculture. Families were changing at this time. Most of the country was still rural, though industrial cities are starting to create a new paradigm for living. Men would leave for work, women would be at home raising the kids in a traditional gender role. And there was a reduced economic value of children. Kids weren't needed to farm necessarily. So you still initially have a lot of people having a lot of children, but as time progresses, you start to see people having fewer children, especially the more they move up the socioeconomic ladder. You also see people actually using birth control to control family size, and as a result, you get some leisure time with families on weekends, particularly. So the family structure is starting to change a bit. And during this time, you have the origins of the women's movement. You first have this cult of domesticity that develops. with these defined women's roles. These women were the leaders of the home and they were to be submissive to their husband. Entire books were written on this. And women reformers resented being relegated to second class citizens. So you had them taking on roles as activists, like Dorothea Dix, working in the mental institutions, but also as abolitionists, and within the temperance movement, women had a leading role in all of those. But they couldn't vote, and they were banned from larger policy discussions. So a gathering of them got together in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And these were the leading feminists at the time, and they created what was a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments that they declared, and they used the Declaration of Independence as its foundation. They declared that all men and women would and should be equal. These were led by women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And they were pushing for property rights, voting rights, the rights for women to seek a divorce, and then to have property after that divorce, and those sorts of things. Women were very reliant, especially financially, on men in the 19th century. So here you have the women at the Seneca Falls Convention. And here is the Declaration of Sentiments. So slavery in the South. A lot of the reform movements kind of get pushed to the back burner because of the sectionalism and slavery issue. In the South, you had slave codes. Slaves could not hold property. They could not be out after dark. They could not congregate in groups, carry firearms, or strike a white person in defense. Basically, people in the South used terrorism to keep their slaves in line. They lived in harsh living conditions. Most places, it was very prison-like. Most slave owners were small farmers, so they couldn't afford large accommodations for their slaves. Many lived on large plantations. They had a decent diet, some medical care, labored in fields, and if you could work as a house slave, you were typically in a better situation. Tobacco starts to decline. It ruins the soil pretty quickly. So you have the shift to rice and cotton in the South, both which we've mentioned before are heavily reliant on slave labor. Cotton becomes king because of the demand from Britain and the invention of the cotton gin. You have an increased number of slaves in the period between 1820 and 1840. And here you have cotton being king. You can see the increase in slaves from 1820 to 1860. As well, it kind of coincides with the increase in cotton at this time, in cotton production. So here you can see the slave states in 1850, slaves as a percent of the total population. So primarily it's the South. In the North, those states had outlawed slavery. So you see already the division in the United States, and how are we going to deal with these territories out here? Because representation in Congress is going to be affected by these, whether or not these states are slave or free. So here you have some slaves working in the plantation. So you have these sectional developments. The North is very diverse, primarily industry, but also small-scale farming. You have urbanization, immigration. You have lots of immigrants moving particularly into cities. And you have a better infrastructure, those canals and those national roads, etc. And it's based on free labor. The South was based on plantation agriculture, very few cities, not very many immigrants, not a lot of internal improvements in infrastructure, and their economy was based on slave labor. So that becomes a huge problem economically between these two regions. So what was it like to be a white person in the South? Well, you had the planter aristocracy, this landowning plantation owners, and they sort of developed their own code of chivalry. There's this cavalier, oh, sir, gentlemanly, sir, in the South. And they were refined. They compared themselves to medieval knights. They would even carry swords, and they would engage in duels. Southern ladies were similar to northern middle class women. There was a cult of honor that defined women's roles. They were subordinate to men, and men would protect them. And they were basically seen as ornaments for men. And in fact, there's some descriptions of women's corsets being so tight that women would faint regularly, and so they thought that women just had weak constitutions. Well, if you can't breathe, you're likely going to pass out. So here you can see some Southerners at a funeral, it looks like. That looks like a gravesite. But see, you can see the teeny tiny waists and these big hoop skirts that these women would wear to sort of show off their beauty. And here you can see the gentleman. You have a growing anti-slavery movement, which is primarily focused in the North. You have people who are relatively moderate and want to see slow change. And then you have some radicals. And this is part of coming out of this Second Great Awakening. And during the Second Great Awakening, people started to view slavery as a sin. And they started to organize, having meetings, and selling propaganda. You had the American Colonization Society, which encouraged sending blacks back to Africa, and actually created a country called Liberia, where people actually moved back to Africa. You had the American Anti-Slavery Society, led by William Lloyd Garrison, who published a newspaper called The Liberator, and he called for the immediate abolition of slavery. So he was writing pretty inflammatory things in the papers, and he was even attacked because of that. So some of the propaganda you had coming out: Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, people writing against the fugitive slave law, which was a pretty harsh law that said if you were a slave found in the North, you could be returned. And in fact, the new film 12 Years a Slave actually tells the story of a man who was a free black who actually got captured and taken to the South, and nobody would listen to him and believe him, and he actually served 12 years as a slave. And prior to the writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin, his memoir was really fueling the abolition movement. I haven't read it, but I heard it's really powerful. But Uncle Tom's Cabin comes in, and it's very popular. It's very easy to read, and it had a huge impact on the North, at getting people to sort of see the plight of the American slaves. You can start to see some of the propaganda that was being circulated. And you had women like Harriet Tubman, who were running the Underground Railroad, helping freed escaped slaves make it to the North. You also had political parties, Northerners running for office on a platform to change the policy. And you had black abolitionists, slaves and former escaped slaves and former slaves and free blacks who helped to organize the slaves. And then you had some violence, people who were willing to take up arms and hoping to encourage the slaves to take up arms against resist. You had the Stano Rebellion, which had a lot of whites fearing blacks, as well as the Nat Turner Revolt. 55 whites were killed, and in retaliation was brutal, and sort of struck some fear into the slaves so that they didn't resist. And like I said, terrorism was really used to keep people in line. Lashings, tearing families apart, etc., was very common. The South was committed to tradition and was very slow to change. They did accept education and humanitarian reforms, but they were not going to accept slavery reform. They viewed it as a conspiracy against their way of life. And so they passed laws that made it difficult for owners to even set their slaves free. And here you can see slaves being branded. So there you have it, on the path to the Civil War: Society, Culture, and Reform of the 1800s.